I'm happy to be with you. Now, in that bio that Melissa read, there was one little detail that I purposely left out. I was raised Seventh-day Adventist, and I went to a Seventh-day Adventist college in South Lancaster, Massachusetts, and that's where I was first introduced to Unitarians. I was a freshman in the fall of 1980, and that little Adventist college began each academic year with a Vespers service at what was known as the Bullfinch Church up the road. Officially, it is the first church of Lancaster, Unitarian Universalist, established in 1653 by one of my ancestors, John Prescott, who was also an ancestor of Prescott Bush and his sons and grandsons. It's known as the Bullfinch Church because the current building, erected in 1816, was designed by Charles Bullfinch, who also gave us such Boston landmarks as Faneuil Hall and the Massachusetts State House. The bell was forged by Paul Revere and Sons shortly after Paul Revere had died. And the preacher each year at this Vespers service for these Adventist students was the current pastor at the time, Tom Wintle. One year I was invited to sit high up on the old Puritan pulpit with him and with my college president, Larry Lewis. We were all dressed in black Geneva gowns. I read from the Geneva Bible, the version used by the Puritans, after which Wintle preached a sermon about Jonah and the whale. That whale was big, he said, really big. Almost as large as some college presidents I know, turning around and winking at the president of my school, who was at least 300 pounds. In January of my freshman year, the desk monitor of my dorm woke me up for a phone call at midnight. We didn't have cell phones in those days or room phones, so I had to go to the lobby and take it. William Cork, this is Charles William Teal, Jr. He introduced himself as a professor of sociology of religion at Loma Linda University in California. And even though he'd done his education in Boston, he forgot which way the time change went, so he thought he was calling me in the early evening, not at midnight. He said he needed an assistant to help him with some research in Boston, and the history department had recommended me. The project was to edit and publish a scrapbook compiled in 1854 by Theodore Parker. Teal had discovered this scrapbook when working on his doctoral dissertation at Boston University on Martin Luther King's protesting pastors. And when he came across Parker's scrapbook, he noticed a lot of similarities between it and the scrapbooks these protesting pastors had put together. So I accepted the job, and over the next 3 years I took weekly trips to the Boston Public Library and to its rare book room where I tried to decipher Parker's notoriously difficult handwriting, and then by careful detective work to determine which of the many abolitionist broadsides in the library's collection had originally been folded up and inserted into the pages of this scrapbook. This dusty old volume of brown acidic paper introduced me to the amazing story of this influential Unitarian theologian. Parker was born in 1810 in Lexington, Massachusetts, a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Divinity School. He was pastor of churches in West Roxbury, Mass., and then in Boston. His members included Louisa May Alcott, William Lloyd Garrison, Julia Ward Howe, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among many others. He attracted notoriety as a preacher in 1841 when he preached a sermon for a friend's ordination entitled A Discourse on the Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. The transient, is the thought, the folly, the uncertain wisdom, the theological notions, the impiety of man. The other, the eternal truth of God. An undue place has often been assigned to forms and doctrines, while too little stress has been laid on the divine life of the soul, love to God and love to man. What matters, he said, is the truth taught by Jesus, not the person of Jesus or his miracles. The universal ethic of love, and not any other thing that we can think of. So it could be proved, if it could be proved, which it can't, that the Gospels were the fabrication of designing and artful men, that Jesus of Nazareth had never lived, still Christianity would stand firm. Now, we're used to Unitarians being very liberal today. That was not so in his day. And that shook him up, shook up the Unitarian church of the time. His church in West Roxbury, which is today called Theodore Parker Unitarian Church, held on to him for a while, but then it became too much. But a group of concerned citizens said, well, we're going to give him a pulpit in the heart of Boston. And they rented out the music hall, and there he preached and became world famous in his day. I want to focus, though, on his life after 1850. He'd been preaching against slavery for many years. But in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. That made it a crime to shelter fugitive slaves and required that all citizens cooperate with federal officers and mercenary bounty hunters to return fugitive slaves to Boston, even out of free states like Massachusetts. In 1854, and this was the focus of this scrapbook that I worked on, one such fugitive, Anthony Burns, was arrested in Boston, where he'd been working for a few months. After a perfunctory hearing, he was ordered to be taken back to Virginia. Federal Commissioner Edward Loring's decision called the law cruel and wicked, but it's the law, and the law must be obeyed even when cruel and wicked. The night before Burns was to be marched to the docks to a waiting ship to take him back to Virginia, Parker preached a fiery sermon in Faneuil Hall in defense of liberty. Virginia ordered the man returned, and Boston obeyed, he said. We are now the vassals of Virginia. It reaches its arms over the graves of our mothers, and it kidnaps men in the city of the Puritans over the graves of Samuel Adams and John Hancock. There was a Boston once, Parker said. Now there is a north suburb to the city of Alexandria. That's what Boston is. And people shouted out, no, you take that back. Now, gentlemen, there was a Boston once, and you and I had fathers, brave fathers, and mothers who stirred up those fathers to manly deeds. Well, gentlemen, once it came to pass that the British Parliament enacted a law. They called it a law, issuing stamps here. What did your fathers do on that occasion? They said in the language of Algernon Sidney, that which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed. They did not obey the Stamp Act. They did not call it a law. And the man that did call it a law here 80 years ago would have had a very warm coat of tar and feathers on him. Well, you can imagine with that kind of oratory, he stirred up the crowd, building to a climax in which he concluded, well, gentlemen, I say there is one law, slave law. It is everywhere. There's another law which also is a finality, and that law, it is in your hands and in your arms, and you can put that in execution just when you see fit. Gentlemen, I am a clergyman and a man of peace. I love peace. But there is a means and there is an end. Liberty is the end, and sometimes peace is not the means. And with that, the congregation dispersed. And in the hours that followed, a group of his hearers, putting his words into action, attacked the courthouse, attempting to batter down the doors to free Burns. They failed. A federal marshal was killed, 13 people were arrested, and the next morning Burns was marched to the wharf under armed escort, including federal troops and 100 U.S. marshals, back to slavery. It was not the end for Parker. He was criminally charged with inciting a riot by preaching that sermon. And he could not wait to defend himself in a court of law with all the papers having their journalists in the seats. He was disappointed when the charges were dropped. So he wrote out and published the defense he would have given in a book entitled The Trial of Theodore Parker for the Misdemeanor of a Speech in Faneuil Hall Against Kidnapping. He wrote it as if he were on the stand speaking to the jury. Put yourself in those seats and listen. Gentlemen, I address you provisionally as representatives of the people. To them, my words are ultimately addressed to the people of the free states of America. Mine is a political trial, and I shall treat it accordingly. I am charged with no immoral act, with none even of selfish ambition. It is not pretended that I have done a deed or spoken a word in the heat of passion or vengeance, or with calculated covetousness to bring money, office, or honor to myself or any friend. I am not suspected of wishing to do harm to man or woman, or with disturbing any man's natural rights. Nay, I am not even charged with such an offense. No, gentlemen of the jury, I am on trial for my love of justice, for my respect to the natural rights of man, for speaking a word in behalf of what the Declaration of Independence calls the self-evident truth that all men have a natural, equal, and unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I am charged with words against what John Wesley named the sum of all villainies, against a national crime so great that it made free-thinking Mr. Jefferson, with all his French infidelity, tremble when he remembered that God is just. I am on trial for my manly virtue, a minister of the Christian religion, on trial for keeping the Golden Rule. It is alleged that I have spoken in Boston against kidnapping in Boston. That in my own pulpit as a minister, I have denounced Boston men for stealing my own parishioners. That as a man in Faneuil Hall, the spirit of James Otis, of John Hancock, and 3 Adamses about me, with a word I obstructed the Marshal of Boston and a Boston judge of probate in their confederated attempts to enslave a Boston man. When the government of the United States has turned kidnapper, I am charged with the misdemeanor of appealing from the atheism of purchased officials to the conscience of the people, and with rousing up Christians to keep the Golden Rule, when the rulers declared religion had nothing to do with politics and there was no law of God above the Fugitive Slave Bill. I was captivated by those passionate words of this Unitarian minister when I first read them as a young college student. And for a playwriting class, I wrote a one-person play based on this story called The Trial of Theodore Parker, modeling it after Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain Tonight, if you recall that. I didn't stop there. As a graduate student in church history at the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg, I wrote my MA thesis on him. Race, Transcendentalism, and the American Dream, the Abolitionist Ideology of Theodore Parker. And I submitted that and graduated 40 years ago this month. Parker was a patriot, first of all. His grandfather, John Parker, was the captain of the Minutemen on Lexington Green the morning of April 19th, 1775. The redcoats came at them at sunrise, and John Parker is said to have commanded, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." His grandfather's musket and one that he captured from a redcoat that day were displayed on the wall of Parker's study, and since then have been displayed at the Massachusetts State House. Parker believed in democracy. He called it a government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. And Abraham Lincoln had a book of Parker's sermons, and he underlined that passage and used it in a famous speech of his own. Parker was a transcendentalist and hung out with people like Thoreau, Emerson, Bronson Alcott, and other famous names. He believed in the eternal truths of liberty and justice that do not come to us from either reason or revelation, but from intuition. He said that our laws are at best attempts to put into concrete form the sentiments of these ideals. He loved the Constitution despite its flaws. He didn't go along with William Lloyd Garrison, who called it a covenant with hell and burned it publicly. He says, yes, it did make provision for slavery, but it was written by men who had also proclaimed, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And he would have added women too. He believed in evolution, that humanity is progressing and that we will eventually grow into the full realization of those ideals of equality and freedom. And that's the context in which he made that famous quote that we heard at the beginning. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe, he said. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. Parker lived amid a great crisis. He saw the government of the United States veering off the path of the founders from democracy to oligarchy, from freedom to slavery. But he had hope. Martin Luther King Jr. had a similar hope, and he used Parker's words to express it. In 1965, standing on the steps of the Alabama Capitol at the end of the march from Selma, Dr. King said these words. I come to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long. Then he quoted a hymn by John Greenleaf Whittier. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Both Parker and King knew that we will not get there by sitting on our hands and waiting. We will not get there by mere dreaming. We only get there by acting, by marching, by speaking, by living lives of love and justice. I confess that I have been on an emotional roller coaster these past few years. I have gone from hope to despair, back to hope, and again to despair. I thought the election of Barack Obama meant that we had come to that day when children who were born in the era of segregation would see their own children grow up in a world of freedom and opportunity for all. I was stunned by the election of Donald Trump in 2016. It was as if decades of bottled up racism and rage were unleashed again, and the children and grandchildren of Bull Connor and George Wallace had their revenge. I was hopeful when the next election said, no, that is not the America we want. I was again tempted to despair when violent men attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And a year after that, I walked the halls of the Capitol. It was still closed to the general public, but I was visiting a couple of chaplain friends, Barry Black, the chaplain of the Senate, and Margaret Kibben, the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives. Margaret gave me a tour after our conversation, and an officer of the U.S. Capitol Police saw us and said, don't you know that there are no tours allowed? What is she showing you? Let me show you a few things. And they walked me through the events of that horrible day and where they stood. I was hopeful again when Lady Gaga went to the microphone and sang the national anthem at Biden's inauguration. And on the eve of this last election, I was sure that America would once more embrace hope and joy over anger and fear. And yet, the next morning, despair returned. And I reached out to a VA psychiatrist and said, time to start seeing you. I'm going to need help to get through this while trying to still provide hope to my fellow veterans. We are in a shocking period in American history when people claim to speak for God and work to merge church and state while defending federal agents who imprison and deport not just immigrants, but U.S. citizens, U.S. veterans, and children clutching their stuffed animals in fear. Agents who fire tear gas and pepper balls at praying ministers and kill in cold blood Americans who dare to speak up and demand that they heed the Constitution they swore to defend. I am hopeful again when watching millions of Americans marching together against kings, defending democracy and human rights. I have hope, but hope cannot sit still. It must stand up, it must act. It must sometimes claw its way into the hoped-for future, inch by inch. 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes, but ever onward like the sea. Parker concluded one of his sermons with these words: "But my friends, out of all this dreadful evil, we can bring relief. The remedy is in our hearts and hands. God works no miracles. There is power in human nature to end this wickedness. God appointed the purpose, provided the means, a divine purpose, human means. Only be faithful, and in due time we shall triumph over the destroyer. Every noble quality of man works with us, each attribute of God. We are his instruments. Let us faithfully do the appointed work. Darkness is about us. Journey forward. Light is before us." Amen.